The conference will begin shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, please take a seat. Lastly, please check your mobile phone and turn it to vibrate or silent, please. In the following sessions, we will be joined by experts from overseas. If you need interpretation service, tune the channel to number 1 on the receiver, then you can hear the Korean interpretation. When you leave the conference hall, please leave the receiver on the table, please. I think we are ready for the conference. Under the theme of inclusiveness and decentralization, we are organizing 2020 PCAD-OECD conference, and this is the second day. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I am Kim Kyung-mi, today's MC for you. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining us today, following yesterday, and the first participants today, welcome. Like yesterday's session, experts from Korea and abroad will join us online and offline. Yesterday, it was the first day of the conference, so the PCAD and OECD signed an MOU, and with the signing ceremony for future cooperation, we conducted the session 1 and 2 for local decentralization and the fiscal decentralization. We will have 2 more sessions today. We will focus more on the fiscal equalization and the balanced regional development, and it will be followed by roundtable discussions. So we hope to see active participation and interest. Let's begin the third session. The theme of session 3 is fiscal decentralization and regional development in response to demographic change. And Deputy Director Joaquim Oliveira Martin will be the moderator of this session. I think he's joining us online. We will have 2 Korean presenters and 2 discussants as well. The 2 Korean panels are on the stage. Policy Research Officer Byun Kyung-hwa from Presidential Committee on Balanced National Development. We also have Mayor Hong Sung-yeol of the Chungpyeong County. So let's connect to the moderator.
Hello, are you listening? Hello.
Can you hear us?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. So I can start? Is that okay? I can start?
Yes, you may.
Okay, good morning. So let's start with a little 4 minutes delay. So the beginning of this session of the OECD Conference on Inclusiveness and Decentralization. So we are tackling this morning, and morning in Paris, of course. In Korea, I think it's around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and perhaps much later in Japan. So good morning and good evening to everybody. So we are tackling a very important topic. We're tackling the topic of fiscal decentralization and regional development in responses to demographic change. As you know, the issue of demographic change and aging population decline, it's a very important issue in all OECD countries. I think in most OECD member countries, we are going to see a shrinking of population at the regional level. I think we can also predict that in many regions of the OECD, the share of the people aged 65 and plus, although of course this threshold of aging may be sometimes a bit arbitrary, but at least if we take it as a criterion, so the share of this population 65 and older will reach 30% and more in many OECD regions, and in particular, the rural regions will be pretty much affected by this aging of the population. Notably in countries like Japan or even my own country, Portugal, where indeed the share of these people above 65 in total population in some regions, for example, in the interior part of Portugal, is going to be quite high. The effect of this aging and this demographic change is multi-dimensional. Of course, the first impact we can think about is about growth. If we put this decline in the population that will induce a decline in the labor force, you have almost a sort of automatic drag on the potential for growth over the next decades. The OECD has done work on that. Of course, this demographic change will also strain social security systems. That's obvious. A shrinking workforce will have to cover all the benefits for an increasing number of retirees. And of course, there was a number of important reforms of social security systems to address this issue. Another very important issue is, of course, healthcare. This issue was a bit perhaps neglected at the beginning, but now is pretty much on the agenda. And by the way, all these issues around COVID, if anything, even put this agenda even more prominent, I would say, in the policy discussion. So the healthcare systems also are going to be affected by this demographic change. Although I would say the principal driver of increase in health expenditures to GDP is not aging per se, but is more related, for example, with adoption of technology. But ceteris paribus, having a larger share of the people aged 65 and plus in the population will induce, of course, an increase of health expenditure. There is also an impact, of course, on subnational public finances. Subnational governments are doing very important functions in our countries. They are doing most of the public investment, a very large share of public procurement, and of course, the aging is going to have basically two effects. One effect is to decrease revenues because, of course, the economy is going regionally to shrink, and also, of course, it's going to increase expenditures because all these social and social services associated expenditures, that some of them in some countries are decentralized. So this is going to put a sort of a scissor effect on subnational finances, and will put a strain and pressure on the finances of subnational governments. And we know that very often this strain is addressed by reducing public investment, which is perhaps the last thing we would like to see, because of course we need this investment for ensuring a growth potential over the next decades. And finally, I think the very important question that namely will be addressed by Sverker in this panel is the issue, of course, of the multi-level governance systems, which need to be strengthened and made more flexible to reflect these regional disparities. And of course, we need to be very flexible and experimental in these governance systems, because of course, there is a lot of issues around capacity of subnational governments to undertake these reforms and to be in charge of the competencies that they are allocated. And so this issue of governance, of course, is a very important one. So we have a very good set of speakers. We have two presentations and two discussants. So the presentations are, as was already said, is Mr. Kyung Yua Byun from the policy research, is a policy research officer from the Presidential Committee for Balanced National Development. And then we have my friend and colleague Sverker Lindblad, is senior advisor in the Swedish Minister of Enterprise and Innovation. And then we have two discussions. Mr. Seong-Gul Hyung is mayor of Yeongpyu County in Korea. Very good. We have a policy maker in this panel. And then we have also my friend and colleague Akira Oshida from Japan, who is Akira is a vice chair of the Regional Development Policy Committee of the OECD. So without further ado, let's start immediately with the presentation. So 15 minutes each. So we start now with Mr. Kyung Ya Byun from the Presidential Committee for Balanced National Development. So you have the floor. Hello? Ah, voilà, we have a PowerPoint. Okay. So you have the floor.
And then there are many strategies targeting the regions for the depopulation issues. I'd like to talk about this in Korea. If you see on this slide, this was a public promotion advertisement from 2004. This was 15 years ago, but the depopulation was also a serious issue back in 2004 in Korea. So this was the beginning of the aging society, and the depopulation issue began from 2004, and the public advertisement started to be published like this. On the right side, you can see the elderly people, and on the left side, there are two kids. It's been 15 years since then. This is still a social issue that has not been resolved yet. In this process, what I'd like to talk about is the depopulation issue caused by the urbanization and the aging population. And in this situation, the crisis of the local regions and how we should resolve these issues, I'd like to talk about the policy directions in general. As you may all know, I believe that you're familiar with this graph. This is the total fertility rate of Korea. And as you can see, as of 2019, the total fertility rate of Korea is 0.92, which is the lowest in OECD countries. Since the record from 1970s, this is the lowest. In this trend, we initially projected this fertility rate to be 0.86 by 2021, but with this current trend, this will be actually 0.80 in 2020. And with the COVID-19, we believe the birth rate will decrease further. So this is a serious problem for Korea. Among OECD countries, we are the lowest of the low. The average is 1.63. Korea is the lowest of the low as of now. Since 2062, we started a national birth planning policy. When we first began in 1960s, we started birth control policy. After 20 years in 1983, the government has achieved its goal, which is 1.5% population growth and 1.2 birth rate. So we achieved the goal in advance. But since the 1990s, we started to abolish the policy to control the population, and we reached a point where we need a population incentive policy. So 2005, we launched a policy to give incentives for childbirth. So this was the beginning of the low birth rate and aging population society. Considering all of this, since 2005, despite the childbirth incentive policy, Korea's birth rate has continuously decreased. To say in an extreme way, I think this is an utter failure of a population policy, according to some scholars. It means the result of the successful policy has actually become the cause of the failure of another policy. Many countries around the world have childbirth-related policies. Childbirth is actually related to personal choice or attitude for family, or it's an emotional issue as well. And majority of the countries, not just Korea, have many childbirth-related policies. Advanced countries mostly have policies to boost their population. As you can see here, 21% of advanced countries have childbirth incentive policies, and now 55% of countries have this kind of policies among the advanced countries. For developing countries, now 50% of advanced developing countries have childbirth-related policies. So although childbirth is more of a personal arena, the government is intervening with policies with the childbirth. What I wanted to highlight today is that, as you can see in the graph, unlike other countries, Korea's childbirth rate has decreased such a rapid manner. Other countries may have maintained a certain level, even if it decreases. For Korea, we witnessed a rapid decrease, and this is the focus of my presentation. It was almost simultaneous success and failure of a childbirth policy. Why did Korea experience all of this rapid decrease in childbirth rate? That's the focus of my presentation. So, what were the variables that upset the balance of the population? That was the focus of my presentation. This is a demographic pyramid. In the 1960s, you can see this the familiar pyramid graph. In 2067, we will actually have a completely upside down graph. If so, what are the birth rate in different cities and provinces? As you can see, Seoul, Busan, Daejeon. So all these large cities have low birth rate. For Seoul, the national average in 2019 was 0.92, but Seoul's average is around 0.7. And if you go to rural areas or regions or provinces, the birth rate actually increases. Same as the third childbirth rate, the urban areas have lower birth rate. It means that the areas with more population and more density have a lower birth rate. This is actually the same for advanced countries, and this is a natural phenomenon according to some demographic scholars. In other words, in cities, the reproductive ability of humans may actually decrease. So is this demographic change something that naturally happen in advanced society? But the problem for Korea is that why did we witness such a rapid decrease and rapid change of low birth rate? The population is concentrated in Seoul area, and Seoul actually has the most number of child-rearing and childbearing age groups. But the birth rate is decreasing in Seoul, while the birth rate is higher in rural areas. But also, many policymakers and many people see that the decrease in population is an issue of rural areas in Korea. If that's the case, let's see the inflection point of the population change in Korea. In this graph, you can see that starting from 2017, we started to record the demographic changes. At that time, we had about the 4% level birth rate. But in 1984, that has dropped. To maintain the population, we need at least 2.1 child birth rate. That means when a couple get married, and then on average, they should give birth to 2.1 children to maintain the population at the same level. So 2.1 is the basis for population to be maintained. And we were at that level in 1984. And we experienced the first population cliff around 1984 when the number of children born between a couple fell below 2.1. And then we experienced another population cliff in 2001. And in 2017, we experienced the third population cliff. So we are now in an ultra low population. And at this inflection point, what kind of phenomenons or what event had happened in Korea? I think we can observe this considering the different values. In 1986, at the first population cliff, we achieved a rapid economic growth and we focused on urban areas for economic development. So many young people migrated from rural areas to urban areas. So the capital areas and the key cities grew rapidly. As a result, the values for the cities and Seoul have risen, and Seoul and the capital area have become a destination of hope and desire. We used to have a TV series even back in the days about the dreamy life in Seoul. At that time, the fertility rate was so high that the government implemented birth control policy. In 2001, there was Asian financial crisis, and the population was more inflowed into Seoul. So many young people started to feel as if they have to be in Seoul to succeed. So this is called the in-Seoul perception, that all the young people started to have more Seoul-centric mindset. Lastly, in 2017, at the time of the third population cliff, this is not even in-Seoul mindset anymore. This is more about aspiring the best in the urban area. So unless you move into the best part of Seoul or move into the best part of urban areas, your life will not be successful. We have a lot of terminologies such as silver spoon or gold spoon or dirt spoon. In 2017, we had a lot of uses of these terminologies online. Hell Korea, Hell Joseon, which is the old name of Korea, or the gold spoon or dirt spoon. All these terminologies were used a lot during this time. So this shows that young people started to focus on the relationship between the area that they live in and their social level and social hierarchy. So starting from the 1960s, after several decades, Seoul has become so massive in terms of its size. So the Seoul-centric values have become deeply rooted in rural areas of the entire country. So the low fertility rate was also appearing as a social issue along with this phenomenon. So the population is concentrated in the capital area. As of last year, the population in the capital area has exceeded 50% of the total population. So this is a quite extreme situation. This graph shows the net migration rate into the capital area by age. You can see that there's a high percentage of the citizens in their 20s moving into Seoul. So this is the age group with childbearing and child-rearing abilities. And because these age groups are all fluctuating into the urban areas, there's no way the rural areas would see population increase. So to summarize, at the first population cliff, the young people in Korea were migrated to Seoul and the capital area. At that time, Seoul was described as the dreamy place, and this value was indoctrinated to everybody in the country. Young people in rural areas moved to urban areas, so the value of city and the city-centric value, urban-centric values have widely spread to the rural areas. During the second population cliff, we started to see growing perception of in-Seoul mindset. With the third population cliff, this perception has even strengthened even further. And at the moment, the population policy is done by the many different committees in society, and the Ministry of Interior is leading these policies as well. The problem is that can these projects actually make any effect to rural areas? These policies attribute the population problems to the rural areas rather than focusing on the problems in urban areas. Rural areas are witnessing population decrease, and as this population is moving to urban areas, the population urban area is expanding. But because the rural population is decreasing, the population policy is focused in rural areas. So this is the problem. How about the situation in rural areas? We have a subsidy program to acquire population. And on the right side, you can see the childbirth incentive map. So it shows how much you can get in rural areas when you give birth to child. Same for the job creation in rural areas. Many policies want to create jobs in rural areas, but the problem is that many quality jobs are concentrated in a capital area. There's no information and no young people and no quality jobs in rural areas. But Seoul with a high number of quality jobs have low birth rate. So this is a social issue in Korea. Then what is the problem of the current population policy? We focus too much on Seoul, and as Seoul has become the highest value. And in these circumstances, no matter how many quality jobs you create in rural areas, can actually young people move to rural areas? I don't think so. So as much as we maintain the Seoul centricism, we cannot really resolve these population issues in rural areas. Even the quality jobs in rural areas are taken by people from the urban areas. So the smaller municipalities aspire the cities, and there's a hierarchy between different levels of municipalities. I believe this is making the population policy even more difficult for Korea. What should we do then? First of all, I think we need to find the threshold where the population decrease should stop. And we have to create a wall to prevent any further decrease. When we set a target for population policy, we always imagine a positive result and set a positive target. But we have to find a threshold where we should not see any further decrease in population. We have to prevent any further decrease based on that threshold. And depending on the threshold, the right size and right location of the population should be made based on the policy reform. And to that end, I believe that the local decentralization should be made to create a more circular society. You can say, well, I interpreted the local decentralization. Now, the Korean government say self-govern, then power will be distributed. But I believe it should be rather the power is now distributed so that you can self-govern. I think there should be the change in the policy stance. Sorry about the delay, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you went a bit beyond the assigned time because we are very, strict in terms of time limits for this session. So I give the floor immediately to Sverker Lindblad from the Swedish Minister of Enterprise and Innovation. Sverker, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can share my slides, please. Well, I think I can start. I hope you share my slides soon. I can't see them yet, but thank you very much for inviting me to this important panel discussion on demographic change and the effects of that on both national and subnational levels. Here's my slide, thank you. I work at the Ministry of Enterprise and Innovation in Sweden, mainly with regional and rural development issues. But until last spring, I also was the head secretary for a parliamentary committee on municipal capacity due to the demographic changes, because the Swedish government thought that this is such a big challenge in Sweden that we have to look at the capacity at subnational level, especially the municipalities, on how to deal with these challenges. So next slide, please. First, some words about the governance system in Sweden. It's basically a three-tier system with one nation. We have 10 million inhabitants. It's 21 counties or regions, as we call them, and 290 municipalities. OECD often says that Sweden has an hourglass system of a governance system with a very strong national level and also a strong base with the 290 municipalities, but a much weaker waste with the 21 counties. So we can take next slide and look at the responsibilities at subnational level then. Looking at the municipalities, they, as I said, they are quite strong when we look at the responsibility areas. The most important ones is those in red here: childcare and preschools, and primary and secondary education. They also take care of the elderly and disabled, and also social services, but also a number of other issues in the black text. For instance, the planning competence, but also a number of voluntary tasks that most of the municipalities also take on. At the regional level, it's mainly healthcare and public transport, but also regional development that are the main responsibility areas. So next slide, please. Looking at the urbanization and demography situation in Sweden, we can see it looks like South Korea a lot. The urbanization have going on at least since the 1950s. And the left map here, we see the bigger circles are, of course, the bigger municipalities. And the blue color indicates increasing population. The smaller ones with the red and yellow colors indicates decrease in population. And as you can see, it's very clear, it's the bigger municipalities that gain population, that increase the population, and the smaller ones are decreasing in population. While the age group that are migrating a lot is between 18 and 35 years, this cause a lot of demographic challenges, and especially in the right map, you can see the red areas, and they have the most severe challenges out from unbalanced demographic situation with an elderly population. And this is going on and will go on according to forecasts. So we can take next slide, looking at the future a little. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here we can see on county level what is happening in a bar chart with the most critical age groups until the coming 10 years. And the gray bars indicates an increase in the older age group, over 80 years old, between 30 and 50% during these years. And also the younger people are increasing more than the age group in orange, yellow-orange bars here, that actually are decreasing in some of the regions of Sweden, and at least increasing much less than the other age groups. And this, of course, indicates that it will be big problems with both too few taxpayers paying to larger groups, but also lack of labor in the welfare sector. Next slide, please. This also calls an increasing polarization between municipalities in Sweden. The smallest ones, the first row here in red, we are getting more and more of them, both historically and according to forecasts. But also the bigger ones, over 100 inhabitants, also are increasing in numbers and also are getting bigger. And those municipalities in the middle, there are, of course, some fewer than. But it's increasing polarization between different kinds of small and big municipalities. And you can't ask questions, how far can this go? Because all the municipalities have the same responsibilities. So even the smaller ones that are just over 2,000 inhabitants should have the same tasks as all the bigger ones. Next slide, please. This causes two main challenges. The first one is, of course, that decreasing an aging population leads to a lack of capacity in the smaller municipalities. Economic capacity, but also when it comes to labor and shortage of labor. But also, of course, a challenge in the urbanized areas with widening commuting regions. That means that municipality borders not are really corresponding to the functional regional perspective. And this could also cause problems for the municipalities to deal with important development issues. Next slide, please. Besides that, of course, it's a number of specific challenges that are growing in intensity due to this change in demography and also other challenges that are coming. As I said, a weak economy due to the demographic change, but also a higher demand from the population in municipalities. Shortage of labor is maybe a more complex issue or challenge for the municipalities to deal with. The economy or the state always can put in more money in the municipalities if they have that money, and have been so in Sweden for the last years. But shortage of labor, that's a more complex issue. It could end up in a zero-sum game that taking from one municipality are not good for everyone. Next point is immigration and integration. This is both a challenge and a big potential because it costs a lot of money with this immigration. We had a lot of immigration to Sweden from other countries last year, for a long time, I would say, but especially the last years. But it's also is a potential for new taxpayers and for solving the problem with competence if we can use this potential in a good way. We also have seen that it's very much postponed investments that should have been taken in municipalities. For instance, in infrastructure systems like water and sewage systems and roads and so on, schools, of course. Then we can also see that municipal costs are growing faster than demographic demand, and that's a problem. It's more and more demand from people living in the municipalities. And last but not least, the climate change is also a big challenge that the municipalities have to deal with. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what can we really do about this challenge that we really see in very many of the Swedish municipalities? How can we strengthen the capacity at subnational level? So next slide, please. First of all, we have to ask ourselves what we really mean with better capacity at subnational level. Of course, more resources, as I said, more money from the state, more skilled labor and competence. That's, of course, something that we want, but it's not easy, of course. Secondly, we can also think that an adaptation of responsibilities and tasks to different municipal abilities could be a way to go. We could, the municipality level, have a lot of tasks now. Should they have fewer tasks to adapt, being able to adapt to the big challenges that they have ahead? Some claims that they actually should have more tasks, but that's maybe the more stronger municipalities. And then, of course, adaptation to new territorial contexts is also a way to gain better capacity to the urban functional areas, for instance. Most important here, I would say, is the red text here, that municipalities and regions should both have operational capacity to manage the everyday service to the citizens, but also a strategic development capacity for the future. And we can today see that too many smaller municipalities don't have this strategic development capacity to cooperate with the neighbors, to have an analytical capacity to see what is important for the future, and so on, to learn from each other, to have the possibility to learn how to use digitalization, for instance, to be more effective. Next slide, please. We can see that there's some options now that is possible. Of course, more support from the state with money, of course, using the tax equalization system that are quite extensive in Sweden, but we can see that it's need to adapt even more to strategic or structural differences that we have in Sweden. Also, more of municipal cooperation is already there a lot in Sweden, but it should be more strategic, building on analysis on what is really needed and who should cooperate with each other. Municipal mergers, of course, is a possible way to go, but it's a very sensitive issue, of course. In our inquiry work, it was clearly said it should be voluntary, but we could have incentives. And we think that it could be very useful to use this possibility when we have municipalities, especially in functional areas close to each other. That's a way to gain capacity. We could change tasks and responsibilities. That's also very complex, but it's an ongoing discussion all the time. Should the schools be a responsibility for the municipalities, or should it be a state responsibility? So that's an ongoing discussion to take away some responsibilities to more adapt capacity to the future. And then this can also be done asymmetrically. The smallest municipalities maybe can have fewer tasks, but the bigger municipalities can have the same as today. This is a complex solution. We have it in some other European countries like Spain and Czech Republic, where it developed such systems. But our conclusion is that it's too complex and not good for the democratic system to have such a system. And then, of course, other ways to higher efficiency is important to look at. Digitalization, of course, but smaller municipalities today not really have the capacity to take on board all these possibilities within digitalization. But it must come more of this if we should cope with the demographic change that we have today. So that was my final conclusion. Next slide, please. We think this is really the important issues to deal with for the future in Sweden, and it will be at least some of these suggestions that we have in this inquiry work, but we don't know yet what will be implemented in Sweden, but we can come back to that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sverker. So I think these two presentations were quite, I'd say, complementary. The first one addressed this issue of rural-urban migration and the fact that this population going into big cities adopt urban values, and then this feedbacks in some sense in the fertility rate. So all the policies to increase fertility are a bit sort of constrained a bit by these mechanisms. And I think, Sverker, you really insisted a lot on a very important dimension, which is this indeed capacity and governance dimension. So we have now two discussants. We start first with Mr. Seong-Yong Hong, mayor of Yongpyong County in Korea. Could we give the floor to Mayor Hong, please, for I would say around 5 minutes.
Good morning and good afternoon. I am Hong Sang-yeol, the governor of Jungpyeong County and also the president of the Korea Association of Agricultural and Fishing Counties. First, I am honored to be here to seek for the directions of regional development with OECD as well. I've been living in rural areas, and I am also the chair of the municipality council, and I've been the mayor of a rural area county for 10 years. People talk about population extinction in rural areas, aging society, and low fertility rate, and I believe that these issues are exacerbating. Everyone is so concerned about these issues. And in Korea in particular, I believe we are more concerned because the fertility rate is rapidly decreasing. And in the future, we may not even have the population who will be engaged in social activities and economic activities. Even for our county, Jungpyeong County, until a few years ago, the fertility rate was quite high, but recently this has rapidly dropped. All of these issues were already predicted. The Korea government has spent around 20 billion Korean won as a budget for the population incentive policy, but the fertility rate is continuously dropping. So this is something that we have to focus on. But the reason for depopulation and the decreasing fertility rate, I believe it is related to the issue of child care and education. The government is and has been supporting for the childcare for the welfare system, but the newly married couple or the fertile women have to have the mindset that they want to have kids. France is actually being introduced a lot as a successful case. In France, whether or not to give birth to a child or to get a job and start to work, I believe there's a clear boundary between that. Whereas in Korea, we talk a lot about how women have to choose either giving a child birth or have a career. So it's difficult to maintain both. This is why young people in Korea don't really want to give birth to a child nowadays because of their career. I believe we need a full support from the governmental level to this end. And the urgent issue that we are now faced with, I believe, is not just the depopulation and the low fertility rate, but also climate change. So more innovative policy should be devised and planned by the government. Of course, it's not going to be easy to reform the policy because there are complicated issues, but unless we speed up now, we will be faced with even greater problem. I was impressed by the two presenters' presentations. The senior advisor Lindblad from Sweden suggested that the restructuring is necessary because of polarization among cities, and the stronger government support, cooperation among small cities, and strengthening of capabilities of each local government for management and strategic development are in need. And the policy researcher Byun Kyung-hwa said that urban-centric values threatens rural areas and argued that since the reasons for depopulation lies in large cities, including capital region, for regional development, quality jobs should be distributed to rural areas. And the country has many projects for regional development, such as innovative cities and administrative capital. But if you see the cases recently, there is a case of deregulation in the capital. There is open opportunities and more opportunities for businesses in capital areas. So the businesses are moving to capital areas from rural areas. This causes more urban problems, and rural areas are being neglected and lagging behind in terms of the development. So the balanced national development is being pursued by the government, but we are seeing the phenomenon completely different. It is because we have different directions in terms of the population policy, and even the National Assembly and the number of lawmakers. The majority of the lawmakers at the National Assembly is from the capital city, so the interest in the rural areas is much lower at the National Assembly. In the current situation and environment, I believe the crisis we face is only going to continue. As the policy researcher mentioned, the central government should transfer its power to the rural areas. I believe the discussion is quite active in Korea about local decentralization, and we are actually we have finished and completed the first phase of a fiscal decentralization government plan. So I am very hopeful. But how much should we invest in rural areas for regional development, and what's the value of a balanced national development, and what's the value of the regional development? We should establish all of these in an appropriate manner so that we can resolve the population issue. In rural areas, population is decreasing, and many say, should we really invest in SOC facilities in rural areas? If you see different municipalities, many regions have the same projects. Even in our county, we have implemented a lot of tourism projects, but in the neighboring counties, they are implementing the same project over and over again. with the government budget. We have limited population in Korea, and they may visit different counties, and of course, they may enjoy different counties, but they will see the exactly same thing. We need a unique regional development that fits the characteristics of different regions, and the central government should make more efforts to strengthen the capabilities of regional government in that direction. With the more local decentralization and more guideline from the central government, I believe we can achieve this goal. Even now, the central government is implementing the Omnibus Decentralization Act and Comprehensive Enactment Act, and etc., etc. But I believe we need to hurry up a bit more. I'd like to talk to you about the examples from our Chungpyeong County. Of course, it is a small county. When I first became the governor, the population was 34,000. That has grown to 37,000. Or other counties are seeing a decrease in population, but for our county, increase is the population trend. Many people talk about population and budget when they talk about the autonomy, but for any county, budget continues to increase, but population continues to decrease for every county in the country. So this is something the Korean government should be aware of. Even within our county, population continued to decrease in the past, and because of education, many young people would move to urban areas. So we wanted to resolve this issue. I'm not going to give you all the details, but we implemented very bold educational policies. So we wanted to prevent some of the young students from leaving the county, and we have achieved quite a lot. Nowadays, the students in our region are required to go to the schools within the region. So this actually helped us prevent leakage of the talents and in population. Another thing we focused on was safety. The government has expanded various institutions to secure safe living, and we also focused a lot on safety, and we invested a lot and a lot earlier than other counties. And in terms of the safety index, our county always ranks quite on the top. For life and living SOC, we have briefly talked about this before. Education, environment, and living conditions, and the welfare system, all of these should be enhanced in terms of the quality of services. And as a result, the residents' happiness level has gone up. As a result, the fertility rate is around 1.4 within our county. This is quite high compared to the national average, and I think there is a reason behind that. So I don't think the local government cannot do these policies alone. As long as you imagine the policies based on the certain characteristics of every region, you can materialize these policies. So the time is up. I'm going to wrap up here. So anyway, many people are worried about the extinction of rural areas. I believe the government, the central government, can come up with some policies to incentivize the more childbirth, and I believe the OECD countries is aware of the seriousness of the situation in Korea, and I believe we can cooperate together to improve the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Ong, for these comments. We are really very constrained in terms of time, so I'm going to give immediately the floor to Akira-san for your comments. Akira-san, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Related to fruitful presentations and interesting comments, I'd like to introduce the Japanese experiences on this topic. Wait a minute. Japan has experienced the most rapid population growth in OECD countries after World War II, and will experience soon the most rapid depopulation with most higher rate of aging. The peak of Japanese population was the beginning of the 21st century, which marks 127 million people. However, from now on, it's estimated to reduce rapidly to just over 100 million in 2050, with 38% of aging rate. That means 1/3 will be the elderly people who are over 65 years old. This future image will be not only for Japan, but also sooner or later for almost all OECD countries, of course, including Korea. In 1950s to 60s, the domestic migration from regions to metropolitan areas reached at the level of 650,000 people. After 1980s, it becomes a rather mild one, but the fundamental tendencies have been continued in spite of the slowing down of total population growth. Until 2050, the population increase is estimated only in limited metropolitan areas. And in 60% of areas, the population will decline to half or less. And the 20% of areas will become uninhabited. A certain number of small-sized cities are confronting to the risk of disappearance in near future. And as for the regional development policy concept, in 1950s, it was balanced territorial development, which collects over-concentration by redistribution through public investment by central government. In 1980s, the settlement becomes a key concept, which develops areas through more decentralized and place-based way according to their own characteristics. In 21st century, looking ahead, the future depopulation and rapid aging, it becomes important to reorganize area with renewal of the social capital in a more compact way. This shows the relevant urban regional policy, so-called the compact city plus network. It contains connecting city centers and the local cores with user-friendly transports, which aims at the improvement of life service functions and the revitalization of sustainable regions. Supporting measures for this policy is composed of decentralized method like this. And this is an example. The Toyama city, located in the north central Japan, is realizing compact city like this. Okay. In addition to this situation, considering future society after coronavirus crisis, as discussed in the next session precisely, digital network will have vital importance, as this hybrid style conference today shows. The combination of new digital technologies and big data collection will create smart cities. I understand that the Korean people are successfully coping with coronavirus crisis by digital approach. These experiences must be precious references for smart cities. Japan is promoting smart city project through the platform of public-private partnership. In this platform, the local governments play an important role, as well as private sectors and academia. Considering the regional policy in these circumstances, we must find out a very narrow path to difficult solution. If Japan's challenges aiming at the compact and smart cities networked broadly each other offers some useful hints for you, it would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akira-san. So I think we had a very, good set of presentations. We saw, that demographic aging of population is going to have very important consequences on this kind of system of regions and cities. They are going to modify the spatial equilibrium. It's very important also that because it's a system and these interactions need to be managed in a very integrated way. It will be very important indeed to invest on the systems of governments that was stressed so strongly by Sverker. I think we are reaching now the time limits for this session. We are already a bit late. So I would like to really thank Kyung, Sverker, Seong-oh, Mayor of Pyongyang City, and Akira-san for all the presentations. And now I would give the floor to the hosts for the next session. So thank you so much. And good morning and good evening, good afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We have around 5 seconds of difference online and offline. That's why we have a bit lagged questions and answers. And the session 3 was moderated by Mr. Joachim Oliveira Martins on fiscal decentralization and regional development in response to demographic change. Please give them a big round of applause. Well, then, with that, we have just had a heated discussion going beyond the expected time, and we will have a 10-minute short break and resume the session 4 at 5:10. And coffee and the nibbles are served on the lobby, so please take a fresh air and be back by. Well, today's conference is gathering experts from home and abroad, and this is being operated online and offline as a hybrid concept. And following the session 1 and 2 yesterday, we are now holding the session 4 just right after session 3, and the general discussion session is planned after this session. And for the session 4, we have speakers and discussants ready on the stage. And for this session, we also have some experts overseas joined online, and simultaneous interpretation service is being provided for your refresher. And now it is time to kick off session 4 under the theme of post-COVID-19 consequences for intergovernmental coordination. We have the moderator on the stage already from OECD Fiscal Network Chair, Mr. Kim Jong-hoon, and we have 2 speakers and 2 discussants like session 3. We have Professor Kak Kyun-gun of Daejeon University Department of Public Administration and Deputy Minister Lee Jae-kwan of Local Administration Decentralization Office of Ministry of Interior and Safety. Please welcome them with a hand. And now the floor is yours, moderator. Good morning and good afternoon. Well, this conference is jointly hosted by PCAD and OECD. I am from OECD, and I work for OECD Fiscal Network as chair. My name is Kim Jong-hoon. And the PCAD and OECD have jointly picked up a very important theme for today's conference, and I'm very pleased to be part of this. Concerning fiscal decentralization and autonomy, OECD has been carrying out diverse researches, and it has deep knowledge and expertise. And with regards to fiscal decentralization, we have ample statistical data. So in this regard, this international conference being held by OECD and PCAD jointly. I wish that we could continue our mutual cooperation in terms of research areas so that we can deepen our knowledge and activate more surveys and activities. From now on, for our OECD members, I would like to moderate the session in English because I am here as chair of OECD. So for our member countries, I think it would be better for me to moderate in English.
Financing at Health Organization, World Health Organization. And also my thanks to Professor Hyun-Gung Kwak at Daejeon University for his presentation, and Mr. Incheol Liu, Director General at the Ministry of Interior and Safety. So without further ado, let me first ask two presenters for their presentations, and then two discussions for their comments. As you know, we have 50 minutes each for presentation and about 10 minutes, hopefully, for discussions. Please, Mr. Kwak.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Nice to meet you all. I'm the first speaker of the fourth session. My name is Kwak Hyun-gun. I'm a professor of Daejeon University. First of all, I'm honored to be participating in the PCAD-OECD conference. I'm very pleased to be here with you. I am given only 15 minutes, and I have a lot of materials that I've prepared, so I'm going to speed up a bit. I'd like to talk about the post-corona era and the local decentralization. The COVID-19 crisis has caused a global uncertainty and crisis. It is a mega threat, a great threat, and then challenges have been caused to different countries around the globe. So in this regard, the local autonomy is now faced with a testing bed, and I believe how we overcome will be an important issue. Before we talked about the wicked problem, but the COVID-19 has overcome that level. Now we are talking about the turbulent problems because the COVID-19 is a transformative issue, according to the scholars. So if you see the characteristics of a turbulent problems, in the past, the wicked problem, because of the complexity of the problem, we cannot really identify the causality, and we cannot really define. And there are many organizations, agencies involved, so administration effort was necessary for wicked problems. But in addition to these characteristics of wicked problems, it is now inconsistent and unpredictable. So the unpredictability and uncertainty has been added to the turbulent problems, and this is the definition of the turbulent problems. To resolve these turbulent problems, we need more than a simple protection or prediction or resilience. We need creative and rapid and agile or prompt public organizations. Sorry, I cannot really read all the screen, so I read this. So the network and partnership between the private sector should be established so that we need a more robust governance strategies that requires a partnership with the private sector. I'm going to skip this area, but what is the robust governance strategies? It involves scalability, experimental prototyping, modularization, bounded autonomy, bricolage, and strategic polyvalence. So all of these are included in the robust strategies according to the European scholars. Scalability means that when the problem expands, then the solution should be expanded in size, so we need to have availability for that. For experimental prototyping means that when we are given a new problem, we need to be able to experiment the solutions and adopt the solutions immediately. Modularization means that when we have a system, we need to have different modules of the system so that we can assemble them and disassemble them. And this is something that we have witnessed in Korea's quarantine system. I'm going to talk about this later. Bounded autonomy means that the central government should be the control tower and the local government should play a steering functions for more flexible adjustment of the policies. Bricolage means that any methodologies and solutions that we used as a practice should be completely changed in terms of its purposes in a new environment. For instance, in the manufacturing production, facilities can be completely shifted to a production facility to produce something new. This is actually a global phenomenon. Lastly, the strategic polyvalence. It means that when we resolve the issue, we have to think about different objectives of one solution. For instance, the testing of the COVID-19 can be used for tracing and quarantine. So other connecting objectives can be also resolved by the same solution. So this refers to that capability. So for robust governance strategies, we need various factors that I've just mentioned. And next is adaptability of the robust governance. It means that when we have robust governance, is it just a single system of a nation, or is it just or is it something that could work in the local government or central government or intergovernment level? It means that we have to consider multi-level government and multi-level governance, and through interaction between different levels of governments, the weakness in the governance can be supplemented or amplified or buffered. So this is the meaning of the multi-level governance. What I am trying to emphasize today is that the central government and the local government have different levels of governance, and in the Korean quarantine system, they can complement with each other to create more amplifying effect and enhance the robust governance effect. So that's something that I'm going to talk about from now on. But in relation to the multi-level governance, each governance has different characteristics, and to identify the different characteristics, we talk about two different capabilities, which are exploitation and exploration. Sorry, I have to flip the screen. As you can see on this slide, exploration means about risk-taking to find new solutions, or experiment to actively seek for the solution. So it's about experimenting new solution. And exploitation is about utilizing the existing systems and resources in a more sophisticated and effective manner. Also through the collective action or collaboration, how can we enhance the system? So this is more safety-oriented. So that we can reduce the cost coming from the uncertainty. So this is safety oriented, whereas the exploitation that I mentioned before are quite opposite. As you can see here on the slide, this is exploration capability, and the y-axis is exploitation. The robust governance is a governance where the 6 major factors are all combined together. And the rigid governance means that exploitation is quite stable and is well used through the collective control. But when it comes to new change, it's quite slow to adapt. And the flexible governance is a information-less governance. So it is good at adopting new changes, but it does not have any government or the control tower. So what I want to talk about is that by utilizing these models, I want to explain the Korean quarantine cases. In the beginning, in January, the COVID-19 confirmed case appeared, and after that, in February, we started to have a rapid increase in the number of confirmed cases because of a Daegu branch of Shincheonji, which is a minor religious sect. So there was an exponential increase in the number of confirmed cases. In this situation, we decided that we have to control the situation in Daegu. So this was a very emergent situation in the initial phase. The local government and central government made a response, and looking back, the 6 strategies that I just mentioned about the robust governance all appeared. Of course, we cannot say it was 100% perfect, but let's look through each and every one of them. When it comes to scalability, in February, when the COVID-19 confirmed cases started to increase in Daegu City, as you may know, we didn't have enough treatment facilities, and then Daegu City requested actively to the central government to use the university dormitories as a treatment facilities, and public institutions and the corporate training centers and training facilities were also used to treat patients with mild symptoms. Daegu doctors also had unofficial networks among doctors, so they communicated with other doctors in different regions. And these doctors appealed to the doctors across the nation, so all different doctors in different regions came down to Daegu City to play an important role to mitigate the situation in Daegu City. For experimental prototyping, I believe the central government played a big role. At the end of January, only 4 confirmed cases appeared in Korea, but the Korea Centers for Disease made an emergency approval of the reagent for testing kits. So this was a big factor to control the situation in Daegu. And also, we established a drive-through screening station in Daegu for the first time in the world. So this was a prototyping from the COVID-19. Also, the local government started dialogue on relief subsidy. And the governor of Gyeongnam province talked about the disaster-related basic income and relief subsidy. This has become more involved in terms of the system and institution. Bounded autonomy in the Korea's quarantine. As soon as the COVID-19 broke in Korea, all 17 metropolitan governments responded and controlled the citizens, and all the fiscal resources and other resources have been allocated and distributed. Also, the local governments in the end provided caring services directly to the citizens independently. Also, they made innovative proposals such as the relief subsidy. Next, modularization of Korea's quarantine case. As I mentioned, the infectious disease testing, economic compensation, and gradual opening of societies, all different governments introduced this system so that the Korean quarantine system would be comprised of different factors. Also, the testing, tracing, and treatment were all modularized, that could be used all together as well. For bricolage in the Korean quarantine cases, cases, we can think about the health mask sales. And this was distributed based on a 5-day rotational system to the citizens. And this was the innovative idea appeared in Korea. I talked about the robust governance strategies that we could see from the Korean quarantine case. But what are the lessons that we can get from this experience? So the challenge for the decentralization in the post-COVID era. Well, the COVID-19 is not an exceptional case. I believe that this is something that can actually happen quite often in the future. So we need a robust governance system. When we talk about decentralization, we talk about decentralization, autonomy, or centralization, or we always talk about this either or something else. So I believe we need some different dialogue surrounding this issue. In the future, civic society, private sector, the central government and local government should have a flexible communication and cooperate with each other to enhance the capability to resolve problems in the future. Something that we cannot overlook is that one of the biggest changes from the globalization is that the capital, labor, the social issues were all cross-boundary. But with the COVID-19 case, the nation-state level quarantine has become important, and the central government has played an important steering function and roles, which was important change. I showed you about of the graph with 4 different types of governances, depending on the exploitation and exploration. The governance that we could see from the Korean quarantine, is it 100% perfect? I don't think we can say that. But if you see the details, the governance of the central government and the local government were a bit different, and I interpreted it in my own way. As you can see in this slide, in ordinary circumstances, the local government maintained local level flexible governance, whereas the central government maintained a more rigid governance. So local government were able to adapt more promptly before the COVID-19. With the COVID-19, the local government and also regional civic society networks. So this is more of a local governance rather than local government. So they made a lot of requests to the central government, and as the central government made response to this request, their capabilities started to overlap and expand like this. Through the COVID-19 case, the regional flexible governance would actually expand and enhance the capability of the central government in total. Lastly, in terms of the turbulent problems, and in order to resolve these turbulent problems, we need to enhance the flexibility of local governments and to create robust governance of local governments. And we need central government to play steering functions and responsibilities, and local government should make an experiment at a local level. At the same time, many authorities should be transferred to local government, but at the same time, the local government should be equipped with the capability to resolve these issues. And the passive governance is not enough, because the local government should be able to overcome problems themselves independently. Of course, the local government made some efforts in the COVID-19 crisis, but they should make more efforts in the future. We established many economic social strategies against the COVID-19. Also, the local government can come up with more public strategies so that it can cooperate with the central government to overcome any future issues. Also, there are many barriers and walls between different administrative functions, and how can we modularize these different functions, to segmentalize and combine these different functions together. So this is something that we should consider for the future. Also, the bureaucratic culture that does not tolerate any mistake is another issue. We are emphasizing active administration, and active administration is extremely important in the turbulent problem, and we have experienced this through COVID-19 crisis. The key of my presentation is that, as we all have felt, the local government made some good work, and also the unofficial networks made great works. For instance, in Daejeon, they had to distribute masks, and the elderly people could not make it all the way to pharmacies, and the local communities would create masks and deliver the masks to the elderly citizens. This is a self-organization. Not the government, but the civic societies and local communities would create some kind of network to exercise their capability along with the local governments. And this is a robust governance as well. And I think this is issue of local democracy. So in Korea, the important issue of decentralization is that so far we have focused too much on the local decentralization, but I think in the future, through local democracy and the local decentralization, citizens should be aware of the importance of cooperating with the local government so that they can have more capabilities to respond to these turbulent problems. In the same context, the COVID gave us an important lesson, which was that not just the face-to-face relations, the online communication should be strengthened. And how are we going to strengthen this? And how are we going to foster digital democracy for more robust governance? The problem is that this is not the different concept. It means that with the digital democracy, the face-to-face communication is also important part. So there is a limitation in digital democracy, but at the same time, the online participation and face-to-face participation should be considered in terms of their pros and cons in fostering the participation by the citizens. At the same time, another important thing is that the Korea and the global world as well, we are considering the sustainability for future generations and how can we maintain resilience against these crises. This is something that should be discussed not just at a central government level, but at local level and community level. So in the end, the local governments and the rural areas should establish robust governance, and they should exert their all efforts to establish that governance. Sorry that it was a bit too long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kwak. Let me now ask Lamia for your presentation. Are you ready?
Yes.
Are you ready,
Can
Lamia?
you hear me?
Hey. So go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. 안녕하세요, Korea. Mr. Kim, Mr. Kwak, Mrs. Sukat, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the Committee on Autonomy and Decentralization of Korea for organizing this very important conference. Today, I'm very pleased to present the work we carried out at the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. As part of our mandate on regional development, multi-level governance and decentralization, we have produced a note on territorial impact of COVID-19, managing the crisis across levels of government. This is the title. This note is accessible on the OECD COVID-19 Hub. It's accessible in English, French, and Spanish. And should you like to translate it into Korean, we'll be very happy to explore that with you. So in my presentation today, I will first provide some data illustrating the territorial dimension of the crisis and how there have been different geographies of the COVID-19 impact. And in the second part, I will focus on the implications this has on policy and intergovernmental coordination, including some preliminary guidelines to help governments manage the crisis and prepare for the recovery. So I'm going to share the screen now. Here we are. Can you confirm you can see the screen?
Yes.
Great.
Very good.
So let me start with a couple of words about the territorial impact of the crisis. So beyond the health tragedy of the coronavirus, the pandemic has triggered the most serious economic crisis of the last decade. We know, of course, that the impact of the COVID-19 has been really different across countries, but what is less well documented is the differences within countries. And the crisis has a strong territorial dimension for two reasons. First, the first reason is that regions and cities, they have been at the front line of managing the crisis everywhere. In many countries, actually, they are in charge of critical aspects of healthcare, social services, including elderly care, education, but also they are in charge of utility services and local economic development. And during the crisis, they had to ensure the continuity of those local public services while taking some very specific measures to protect the vulnerable population that were that are still most affected by the crisis. And the second reason is that within OECD countries, the pandemic is hitting some regions and cities harder than others. This is true from a health, economic, social, and fiscal perspective. Let's look at the health dimension first. The chart on the screen shows significant disparities in the number of COVID-19 related fatalities. And this is especially true in Colombia. Let me show you. Yes, here you can see. In Colombia, in Italy, in Spain, in the United States, and the United Kingdom. On average, we have seen that in the OECD, the most impacted region recorded actually almost 70 more deaths per 100,000 inhabitants than the least impacted region. And this data are for September. They are quite recent. In Korea, and I'm going to show you where is Korea here, the fatality rate is one of the lowest, as you can see on the screen. But still, there is still a 7 percentage point difference between Daegu and Sejong, which is the less affected region. A number of factors explain this, including the way the first clusters of cases developed. And of course, urban density is a major important factor. We see that, for instance, Mexico City concentrates more than 15% of Mexico's overall deaths. In Sweden, for instance, Stockholm concentrates 40% of the death of the country, and Santiago represents 70% of death in Chile. However, we have to be very cautious about the question of density, because density per se is not necessarily a problem. It is when it is combined with a lack of appropriate measures like contact tracing, poor housing condition, that things can get worse. And we have seen very dense cities like Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, having limited spread of the virus because they were very proactive measures. Access to hospital bed is also a very important and critical factors. And actually, we have seen that remote rural regions, which also have higher shares of elderly population, for instance, tend to be less equipped with hospital beds. This is a big issue because the recent data that we are collecting show that the virus now is starting to diffuse toward less dense region. And in the United States, for instance, we are seeing that the virus is affecting more and more rural areas. So I was talking about the health impact. Let's talk about the economic impact. It also varies across regions. It depends, for example, on their exposure to global value chains, especially during the lockdown period, as well as on their sectoral specialization. At the OECD, we have calculated that the sectors more affected by lockdown measures account for about 40% of total employment on average. But the risk, again, greatly vary depending on where you live. The chart on the screens here shows that the share of jobs potentially at risk under condition of lockdown and travel restrictions can vary by more than 20 percentage points on average across OECD regions. It also shows the high vulnerability of tourism and local services. Here you can see this sector, they are represented in blue and violet bars. Touristic regions, I give you example, such as Algarve in Portugal or the Greek regions of South Aegean, they have 40% of job potentially at risk. Let me show that by putting the cycle here. And in Korea, which is there, you know, the highest share of jobs at risk actually is in Jeju-do, the Iceland, where 16% of employment depends on tourism, including accommodation and food services. Regions are also impacted differently depending on their teleworkability. This is a very difficult name, the capacity to use teleworking. And the chart shows the share of jobs that can potentially be performed remotely as a percentage of total job. Again, we can see great differences between the less well-adapted regions, typically the rural one, the national average, and the front runners, and usually these are the large urban centers. In Europe, for example, the share of jobs potentially performed at home is 13 percentage points higher in cities than in rural areas. I'm now in Paris. I know that in Paris, the metropolitan areas of Paris, 50% of people can work using teleworking, while in other regions in France is only 30%. There are a large difference, and this is a big issue. The fiscal impact, which is another forms of impact of the crisis on subnational government, is also significant. First, because of an increasing pressure on subnational spending, especially in countries where subnational governments have large responsibilities like Denmark, Sweden, Korea, Japan. And the result of the fiscal network survey that was circulated echo this message. It found, for instance, that 17 out of 20 countries expect an increase in subnational government's deficit and debt. The fiscal impact on subnational government is also significant because subnational government will likely suffer from a strong decrease in tax resulting from declining economic activity, but also from other type of revenue, for instance, due to a more limited use of some local public services like public transport, for instance. So these trends, you know, could result in the famous scissor effect and lead to higher levels of debt, higher level of deficit. So I was saying that, of course, the fiscal impact is huge on subnational government. It's huge on all subnational government, but again, there are some difference between subnational government. Recently, we conducted a joint survey with the European Committee of the Regions across more than 300 European subnational governments, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on local finances. And the results show that large cities, which are the cities with more than 500,000 inhabitants, expect to be hit the hardest. The impact on local finances depends typically on the fiscal flexibility of subnational governments to absorb this exceptional stress, the existence of rainy day funds, and the support of higher levels of governments. Subnational government that rely more on tax revenue, especially those that are sensitive to economic fluctuation, are of course more affected. And this is the case, for instance, in Germany, in Canada, in France. But overall, we can assume that the impact will be long-lasting for all subnational governments, and without adequate support, without adequate intervention and reform, many of them will see their fiscal situation worsen in 2021 and even in 2022. So to sum up this part, three types of impact: health impact, economic and social impact, and fiscal impact. And what is interesting to note is that the geography of this different impact of the crisis don't necessarily coincide. A region can be spared by the health crisis, but can be severely impacted by the economic crisis. And this was the case of Venice. You know, Venice has not been so much affected by the virus, but is now experiencing one of the most important economic crises. So what we can say that there are different geographies of the crisis that overlap, and we need to take that into account in policy response. The question of granularity in policy response is very, very important. Let me now turn to some findings on policy responses. So addressing this differentiated impact requires, of course, designing policy responses with a place-based approach. The good news is that more and more OECD countries now have adopted a place-based approach to manage the crisis over the past month. On the health front, for instance, countries now facing the second waves of infections are taking localized measures on mass closure of schools or restaurants or full lockdown. More and more, it's local. On the economic front, national and subnational governments have announced large economic recovery packages, already much larger than in 2008, with significant support for firms and public investments. And what we have seen is that national recovery packages tend to have more and more an explicit territorial dimension. We can say that it's not enough, but more and more. And for instance, Canada, France, Germany, the EU, and the UK are providing specific support to municipalities and regions. And in certain cases, you know, this support goes to the most lagging regions. We have countries like Finland and Italy, which have set up specific programs to support SMEs at the local level. And in addition to that, we are seeing many OECD countries that are taking measures to relax fiscal rules on subnational spending and deficit. This is the case of France, Denmark, Mexico, and Korea. So to be successful, place-based policy responses really require effective vertical, horizontal, and cross-border coordination. This is not a vague concept. This is really something essential. And this is essential to minimize crisis management failures, which may result in disjointed responses and collective risk. For instance, in some countries, we have seen at the beginning of the crisis, some regions competing for masks, which led to some shortages and even higher prices for masks. So it was a very bad thing. A positive example actually is Korea. Korea has adopted a whole of government approach to manage the crisis, with the Prime Minister sharing the Central Crisis Management Committee, where the relevant ministries, the provinces, and major cities are represented. And over the past few months, actually, there have been a lot of debate about whether a country which has a centralized or a decentralized system is in better position to manage the crisis and its recovery. But the reality is that it's not the degree of centralization or decentralization that makes a difference. What really matters is whether coordination mechanisms are used effectively. So coordination is particularly critical to address the fiscal impact of the crisis. You know, the adoption of concrete measures to support subnational finance are critical to sustain public service delivery and preserve fiscal space for public investment, which is really much needed to ensure recovery. And this slide shows that countries now can take different measures on this respect, acting on the revenue or expenditure side, or adopting measures regarding fiscal rules and financial management issues. It's good to know that actually 2/3 of OECD countries now have already moved in this direction, adopting measures in support of subnational government finance. In the longer term, national and subnational governments will have to prepare recovery plans that ensure the stability, the operation capacity, and the resilience of subnational finance. Going forward, we can already identify 4 key long-term priorities that need to be integrated in the responses to the crisis. The first one is, of course, to strengthen resilience of regions and their ability to deal with shocks regardless of their nature. And this is something that was very strong in the survey that we did. There was a strong concern by all subnational governments now to integrate this resilient dimension in their strategy. It's also very important to continue to integrate climate objectives, the transition toward low carbon economy. The third priority is, of course, to develop digital infrastructure. We have seen to what extent it has been an obstacle for some regions, you know, to manage the crisis, to deal with the economic impact. And the question of regional disparities, how to better ensure urban-rural balance. This is really crucial. We have seen that the impact has been really asymmetric and has exacerbated existing territorial disparities. It's really important that the recovery plan integrate this very important dimension. And finally, you know, as recognized by 90% of subnational governments that responded our survey, coordination in the design and implementation of recovery measures is the most important tool for a successful exit strategy. Thank you so much. Kamsahamnida.
Okay, thank you, Lamia. Thank you very much. Let me now ask Mr. Liu and Ms. Agnes Suket. Agnes, are you ready there? Okay, I will assume that Agnes will join us after Mr. Liu's intervention. Given the time constraint, let me give you 5 minutes to each discussant. 유국장님 5분 부탁드려요.
You have 5 minutes. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Liu Im-chul. I'm from the Ministry of Interior and Safety. I'd like to thank the organizers for preparing this valuable event and inviting me. Korea has effectively responded to the COVID-19, a global pandemic. So the post-COVID-19 and intergovernmental coordination is a meaningful subject to discuss on. So the two presenters gave impressive presentations, and to summarize what I have understood, to successfully respond to the crisis, there are about 4 prerequisites. First off, the regional government should be promptly respond to the crisis, and through the decentralization, sufficient authority should be given to local authorities. Also, the central government should play a role of a steering wheel to establish crisis management system and coordinate state and the local government's functions. And in the process, the central government and local municipalities should closely cooperate with each other, and especially the cooperation is needed between the municipalities because competition may hinder effective cooperation. Lastly, the government and civic society should actively communicate and cooperate. This is another key factor for success. That's a summary in my view. I'm not sure if I made a good summary. the COVID-19 response by Korea, I believe, was effective in all aspects that I've just mentioned. The local government made a prompt on-site quarantine measures and provided a relief subsidy and established a drive-through a screening station. So all these creative ideas by local government were the basis for overcoming the crisis. The central government adopted these new ideas and spread and distributed these new ideas. And among the municipalities, they closely cooperated with each other by supplying some medical products. The central government also promoted quarantine measures on online social media, also disclosed the current status and the risk factors. And by this active communication with citizens also actively participated in the government measures as well. In the backdrop of these results, I believe the decentralization policy by the Ministry of Interior played a key role. The Ministry of Interior and the Safety has been the main agency for decentralization, and we have strongly pushed for these decentralization measures. Of course, we still have a long way to go compared to advanced countries, but we have actively transferred the central government authorities to the local governments. Also, we have expanded the local government's budgets, and by strengthening the administrative and fiscal capabilities of local government, we allow the local governments to be able to respond to the crisis. Also, we established a cooperative council between different governments so that they could coordinate different functions. So we have established this cooperative culture between the center and the local governments. And by pushing for online and offline citizens' communication council, we created a basis for active participation by the citizens. Based on this, the Ministry of Interior and Safety will continuously making efforts for spread of the decentralization and the cooperation and communication. In relation to the duties related to the disease prevention, we believe we need active measures, and we will actively transfer the central government authorities to the local governments. And we are also planning to introduce a self-autonomous system more. For further cooperation, the president and the major governors of the provinces will gather in regular basis for more in-depth discussion, and opinions and the views of the local government will be reflected in our national policy, and decentralization will expand further. I believe thanks to the COVID-19, we will have a more close cooperation between local government and central government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Okay, now, Agnes, are you ready? 5 minutes, please. Agnes, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Yes, I have uploaded a presentation. Do you see it? To make it clearer and faster, you see it?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, it says that I'm sharing it, but if you don't see it, I'll. So thank you very much, and thanks for this really very interesting presentations, and I think touching really on the fundamentals of the issue of decentralization within the context of a pandemic. If we look at the emerging lessons from the COVID-19 crisis, the 2020 experience has demonstrated that a local health event can rapidly escalate into a devastating global emergency, that social and economic stability and development depend upon sustained investments in security. And as the two speakers mentioned, is that intergovernmental coordination is essential for health emergency preparedness for response and recovery, and success or failure rests not only with national governments, but also with community and citizens. So the key question which is asked here, and I think there is already a lot of answers to that, is whether decentralization helps strengthen countries' abilities to collectively respond to a health crisis and enhance health security. A couple of very quick points there is that the International Health Regulation, the IHR, which all governments have agreed to in the World Health Assembly, is the key intergovernmental instrument. This is less known, that it's, yes, it is an agreement by national government, but it is implemented at all levels of government, including at subnational levels. So a country's ability to comply with its commitments under the international health regulations depends also on its local and subnational subnational capacities, accountability structures, and clear and transparent communication between levels of government. So we have now a global coordination of pandemic and a global strategic preparedness and response plan, but there is no question that this plan will be a success only if local governments implement it and fully contribute to it. One area of tension, it's been mentioned, the question of the role of central government as providing the standard and in a way providing the framing of the response or of the preparedness, and the local governments having flexibility in implementing this response, goes back to the question, the fundamental question of the common goods for health. And those are really the fundamental functions of government when it comes to health, and the fundamental areas that require collective action. We're talking here about pure public goods as well as market failures, large market failures who have consequences on health. So we're talking here about areas that the market cannot address and absolutely require interventions of the government, and that have enormous impact on human health and welfare. So you have global common goods, but you have national common goods that coalesce the vision of citizens around what is needed collectively to protect their health. And you also have local common goods. And the tension in a decentralized environment is really to make sure that the national common goods resonate with the vision of local communities about what is their collective vision of what their common good is, and the construction of a common identity. And that's often the question. And we see that in many ways the COVID-19 pandemic opens the Pandora box of identities and the identity debate, because exactly that is at the center of what we need to build if we want to focus on collective action and the commons that markets cannot deliver, but governments are the ones to be prioritizing. So there are 5 categories of common goods for health, and many of them happen at central level, but most of them have resonance at local level. Policy and coordination, taxes and subsidies, regulation and legislation, information analysis and communication, and population services. And it's certainly in the last 2, in the question of information, communication, building trust with communities around the social contract, that we have a fundamental role of local government, as well as in the delivery of population services, those services that require common functions, such as immunization, such as environmental health, such as One Health that includes animal health. These require cooperation and government intervention, and also local service delivery. And that's really a lesson from the crisis, that these 5 functions have often, in a context of globalization of markets, being forgotten, and sometimes government action has been weakened, or there has been a free rider problem in the national conversation, in which these fundamental functions have been overlooked because we were thinking that markets were delivering on better health and better services, and we might not need that much investment in the commons. So all of this now is back in the debate. On the fiscal decentralization, the fiscal consideration, very interesting presentation, and really, really useful work. I think it's really a major contribution to understanding what is happening. Just 3 points there. I think it's important to think about a perspective of principal agent, ensuring that resources are available for and investing in common goods for health. That's not always clear. That decentralized subnational levels are not only about delivering private services, but they are fundamentally about delivering common goods. And the politics, when they are not politics around a common identity, but when politics are fragmented, may actually lead to capture of resources for private services rather than fundamentally investing in those functions. And that's probably a lot of what has happened prior to COVID-19, this underinvestment in the common goods. And of course, the functional accountability structures and the flow of information is fundamental there. Second, one of the key lessons of the pandemic, health systems were not ready. So we had health systems that in many ways were perpetuating models that were developed in the 20th century. And those models delivered a lot of good things, but in many ways are no longer adapted to a globalized world that is facing global threats, such as the pandemic, such as climate change. And this health system readiness and the transformation of health system require an incredible role of local governments in the flexibility that they should have to rapidly redeploy resources. We conducted a survey in the WHO looking at what was the fiscal response generally, particularly the response in terms of allocations of ministries of health budget in the crisis. We found that the flexibility was the most important factor, being able to rapidly redeploy resources. That's financial resources, but that's also human resources. Financial resource, we see that most countries have massively increased resources for common goods, for their public health institute, for their surveillance system, for laboratories, but also massively invested in providing incentives to human resources, because one of the lessons of the crisis is that we did not invest enough in labor markets, and the world is facing a global shortage of the health workforce. And here again, a key role of local government. And finally, the health and socioeconomic recovery perspective that was very well highlighted by the two presenters. We know now that if we want a quick recovery and a meaningful recovery and building the system of tomorrow, building back better, a real reset of the way we see health systems and public policies in health, is to make sure that we structure public policies in a way to ensure that the common good investments are the step zero of recovery. Nothing will be more important than investing in those common goods, just by definition, because markets will not deliver on those. This will require public action. This will require a collective push for the public purse to be allocated to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, let me just briefly summarize session 4. So here is the list of issues regarding multi-level governance and intergovernmental fiscal relations that have been always important. Firstly, the proactive role of local government, and secondly, recognition and mitigation of intergovernmental disparities, and thirdly, the importance of intergovernmental collaboration and coordination. I think we cannot emphasize these issues too much. But I think in the era of post-COVID-19, these issues will be even more important. And Mr. Kwak and Lamia made very interesting presentations that made these points very clear. And I also think that two discussants also made discussions along this line. So thank you very much, Lamia, Mr. Kwak, Mr. Liu, and Agnes. Let me conclude session 4 now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes the session. Please give him a big round of applause. This concludes the session 4. The chair can, moderator and the discussant and presenter on the stage can go back to your seat. We have concluded session 4. We now have the general discussion left. We have so many constructive points. So without a break, we will just reorganize the stage and then begin the discussion right away. Session 4 was on the post-COVID-19 consequences for intergovernmental coordination, and we had presentations and discussion on this. Amid the global uncertainty and the crisis, and we need to establish robust cooperation between the governments to overcome this crisis. I believe this is something that all discussants and presenters have agreed on. The last session is a general discussion. We are reorganizing the stage now. After that, we will invite the moderator and discussants right away. Under the title of Inclusiveness and Decentralization, 2020 PCAD-OECD conference is being held for 2 days. Yesterday was the day 1, today is day 2. We had 2 sessions yesterday and session 3 and 4 today. Yesterday we focused on the physical decentralization. Today we are talking more about the local decentralization. We are now going to invite discussants for the final general discussion session. As soon as the stage is reorganized, we are going to invite the discussants to the stage, so don't leave the hall, please stay with us. The inclusive growth is a shared value pursued by Korea and OECD. Yesterday and today, we've had a 2-day conference, and to resolve regional disparity, we have had some really constructive discussion. Every session, the time was not enough because of the heated debate, and all the presenters gave us some really good quality details. As we conclude 4 sessions, we are going to have more in-depth discussion. The general discussion will follow shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready for the stage for general discussion. All the panels, please come up to the stage. Let me introduce the discussants. The chairperson of PCAD will be the moderator. We have President Kim Han-jong of AMPCC as a discussant, Mayor Heo Tae-jung of Daejeon Metropolitan City, and Lee Jae-kwan, the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, and the Chair Kim Jong-hoon of OECD Fiscal Network. And we also have Luis de Mello, the Director of OECD Policy Studies. They will be joining us for the discussion, and the Director from OECD will join us online. We have wrapped up 4 sessions, and we will discuss on those sessions and discuss more in depth. I think everyone is ready. Now, Chairperson Kim Soo-neun, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Kim Sun-nun. First of all, well, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to hold this international conference jointly with OECD. Well, this is the second day and you must be tired now. But personally, I'm honored to be able to moderate the session. And I wish that autonomous decentralization and fiscal decentralization should be discussed more deeply by PCAD and OECD, and I wish that we could contribute to the further development of this discussion. Recently, aging and demographic change have made an impact on local governments, and the COVID-19 pandemic crisis have been devastating the world in terms of crisis management. So that is why inclusiveness should be the key theme that we need to discuss all together to find out solutions for us. And we also have to assume the accountability for the next generation, and that is why we need to get ready for the post-COVID-19 era. And with that in mind, I would like to right away kick off our general discussion session. And let me introduce our discussants. First of all, from OECD, we have Chair Kim Jong-un from OECD Fiscal Network. And we have our Director Luis de Mello online from OECD Policy Studies. And next, we have Korean speakers, discussants. We have Deputy Minister Lee Jae-kwan of Ministry of the Interior and Safety. And we have Mayor Heo Tae-jung of Daejeon Metropolitan City. And President Kim Han-jong of AMPCC, and also President of the Jeollanam-do Province Council. And let me introduce how we will go through this general discussion session. And we will discuss the topics of session 1 and 2 and session 3 and 4. And we will assign 8 minutes to each discussion for session 1 and 2 topics and session 3 and 4 topics. And once the discussion for session 1 and 2 is over, then Chair Kim Jong-un of OECD Fiscal Network will, Deputy Minister Lee Jae-kwan will give us a summarized comments on this topic of session 1 and 2, and the same will go for the session 3 and 4 discussion. And after that, we're going to have a general discussion session where we will take questions and comments from the floor if it's possible. And during the discussion session, if we receive any comments or questions online, we'll also open the floor to them. All right, without further ado, we would like to discuss the lessons for effective fiscal decentralization and policy implications, which was the title of session 1. And Professor Yoo Tae-hun of Namso University had discussed the policy directions for the fiscal decentralization, and the Director Luis de Mello have touched upon how to enhance the outcome of the decentralization through monitoring and performance monitoring in particular. So if you have any comments on those, then please address them. First, Director Luis de Mello, would you please?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be back, and let me start by congratulating you all on a fascinating conference, and I'm personally very honored to have been with you over these last couple of days to discuss these very important topics. Let me thank Chairperson Kim for the warm welcome. And also it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists. A very warm, if I may, hello to Chairman Kim of the OECD Fiscal Network, my good friend and colleague John Kuhn. On session one, if I may, I thought the key messages that emerged from the discussions are really that although a lot of what's happening in our different countries is very closely related to specific histories, to specific culture, specific cultural traditions, and institutional features of our different societies. So to a certain extent, intergovernmental relations are conditioned by those factors that are to some extent beyond the scope for policy. But there are a number of lessons that I think cut across all that diversity that we see around the world. We had the opportunity to discuss a few of those issues that emerged from the work we are doing at the OECD. The need for a better alignment of spending and revenue on the fiscal front, the merits of boosting subnational tax autonomy as a way of reinforcing accountability, promoting efficiency of decentralized entities. We also discussed options for strengthening equalization systems, and we discussed issues related to clarity in the assignment of functions across the different levels of government, and obviously a final word on the importance of monitoring performance as a way of evaluating how well we are using public resources and the scope that there can be for improvement in all those areas. It was very interesting to see that the alignment that came across in the presentation of the Korean experience when Korea is aiming for a balanced fiscal decentralization process. I think at the end of the day, a lot of those general principles and good practices that are emerging from the international experience shed some light on the ambition of Korea for a balanced process on that front. So a very interesting exchange of views in that session. Very good opportunity to see the points of convergence among the different experiences around the world and how that can inform the ongoing discussions in Korea. Thank you very much.
Next, on behalf of local governments, Mayor Ho Tae-jung will make his comments. Good morning, good afternoon. I am Ho Tae-jung, Mayor of Daejeon Metropolitan City, and this is quite meaningful for me to be able to take part in this discussion. Looking back on the process of organizing this conference and participating in this conference, I said to myself that it is quite urgent for local governments to be decentralized. Well, I've discovered many insights from different presentations of Professor Yu and Director Luis de Mello, and thank you very much for your insightful presentations. And those two presentations have had much implications on us. As you all know, the tax revenues of Korea represent an imbalance of revenues and expenditure. Revenue goes less than expenditure demand, and that is why the dependence level of local government is quite high onto central government. And in that regard, if you look at the status quo of autonomy of local governments, we can easily recognize the importance of fiscal decentralization. And for the autonomous policies of local governments, there are many important factors. And one of them is the lack of rights and authorities to decide or to determine the level of revenues that they can raise by themselves. So autonomy should be highlighted more in the future in terms of policy directions, and I very much agree with that idea of the speaker. But by going through different tasks and programs by local governments, we always are exposed to the disparity of fiscal conditions of each and every local government. So we should discuss on that matter as well. And secondly, depending on regions and local governments, they have their own characteristics and features. So our choices should be made on the basis of those characteristics. And in that regard, we should be given more rights to decide on how to raise funds and tax revenues by ourselves or for ourselves. And there should be amendment of the relevant laws and regulations. That's my suggestion. And I have read through the presentation of Professor Yu, and I agree with that idea. And concerning the New Deal policy of the current Korean administration, despite the announcement made by the president that the focus should be laid on local governments, the leeway is not fully given into local governments. The independence, or especially fiscal independence, should be taken into account when we talk about fiscal decentralization for local governments. And I can make several proposals concerning that point. Within the scope of not giving tax burdens, part of national tax could be transferred into local governments to support them. That could be one suggestion. And another proposal is that as we have severe disparity amongst local governments and authorities, to solve this problem out, as I mentioned earlier, tax equalization through grants should be implemented so that we can ease that disparity. And other than those, government subsidy programs should be matched with local governments, but there are not many local governments who could be fully active in leading those government subsidy programs on their own leeway. And those programs are directly related to the central government's decisions, so there are decreasing number of opportunities that we can explore by ourselves in local field. So unified window is also necessary in cooperation with central government for local governments. And those are several points that I wanted to highlight and share with you. Basically, with regards to local taxes, taxation system should be amended or advanced so that we can have our own rights to increase or to impose taxes, increase the level of our own rights, and the equalization should also be given as right to local governments. Thank you.
I believe that it means that the taxation rights is in several local governments. Now let's talk about session 2 on strategies for fiscal equalization among subnational governments. In the presentation in session 2, Professor Lee Jae-won mentioned that he introduced the fiscal equalization system of Korea, and also he said for the fiscal cooperation between local governments, there should be fiscal decentralization centered around the citizens. Sean Doherty from OECD mentioned about the regional inequality should be resolved through fiscal equalization system. So you mentioned about the fiscal equalization as well. Do you have any additional comments to this? I believe you mentioned it all together. So I'm going to ask Chairperson Kim Jong-hoon on your opinion on session 2.
It's a great pleasure to be with you in this very important session. The theme of session 2 was strategies for fiscal equalization among subnational governments. And first presenter, Mr. Jae-won Lee's key message in his presentation on horizontal equalization was to emphasize the voluntary agreement on the need for fiscal equalization among subnational governments. Whether there will be a voluntary agreement on redistribution is a big question, but Mr. Jae-won Lee thinks that this will be possible if such an idea is based on people-based solidarity. So this is a very normative idea, or it can be said that it's an unrealistic idea, as suggested by one discussant, Mr. Pyung-ho Choi. But from institutional point of view, constitutional law is an agreed contract among people, and if such a constitutional law contains the principle of solidarity, it can be said that voluntary agreement on redistribution is actually implemented in reality. The case of German constitution, which clearly states the principle of solidarity, is the case in point in my mind. I think there are two key messages in Mr. Sean Doughty's presentation on horizontal equalization. The first is that there can be rent-seeking and efficiency cost problems in equalization grant system. And secondly, the design of equalization grants is therefore the key in the success of grant system. Two examples of sound design of equalization Mr. Sean Doughty suggests is transparent and rule-based equalization and representative tax system. So Sean's presentation provides very important guidelines on what not to do and what to do in implementing equalization grant system. Just to avoid misinterpretation of Sean's presentation, let me remind you that there is a difference between correlation and causation. A well-known example is the case of high correlation between the high number of policemen and high crime rate in a jurisdiction. Certainly, the high number of policemen does not induce higher crime rate. Likewise, the large amount of equalization grants might be needed to fight against the regional disparities or high Gini coefficients. So as Sean's guideline at the last page shows, it all depends on the design of grants, whether decentralization and grants can go together in a successful way. Thank you.
Next, I think we will hear the perspective of the government. So please, Mr. Lee Jae-kwon. Good morning and afternoon. My name is Lee Jae-kwon. I'm from the Ministry of Interior and Safety. For the direction of the equalization among the local governments, I believe there's no opposition when it comes to which direction we should go. But within that direction, I think there is something we have to focus on. As the previous discussion just mentioned, for the national subsidy system, I have a few points to make. As of now, when we talk about the fiscal equalization, we focus a lot on the resources. The ratio between the national tax and the local tax is now 8:2, but it should be 5:5. But in terms of the execution, the size of the finance executed by the local governments is actually much higher than this. If that's the case, the national system should reflect the autonomy and the creativity of the local governments. The key of the fiscal equalization is not about where the finance is. I believe the key is how can we reflect the autonomy of the local governments. In this regard, the national subsidy system, of course, not all of it, but some of the projects are focused on the central departments and ministries. So when it is actually implemented in the local regions, there is barriers or separating walls among different projects. And municipalities make efforts to secure as much as national budget. When it comes to efficiency, I believe that some projects are in the late order. So I think this is allocation of budget based on the supplier's perspective. I believe we need to find this to do this from a demand perspective. I believe the projects should be actually applied by the local governments, and we can collect these projects as a package. And if these projects are linked with each other, then it will become a lot more effective. And also the budget will be more effectively allocated and used. As a conclusion, of course, it's not 100% desired by the local governments, because the central government has a guideline for a national subsidy program, so they have some restrictions. But still, if we go into that direction, the creativity and the opinions of the local government will be reflected a lot more. Also, there will be some remaining projects after the application by the local governments. And this will be actually a measure to assess the projects by the central government. It means the allocation of resources can be made based on the demand in the market. The local governments in planning this project need to strengthen their own capabilities, and they will make efforts, I believe, to resolve this issue. The discussion on fiscal decentralization was quite effective, and I believe the government had some weaknesses and also achievements. As we progress for the future directions, I believe we have to consider this national subsidy system and program together. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. Well, session 1 and 2 highlighted the importance of fiscal decentralization and fiscal equalization. And through this session, we have come to confirm that how important those two are. And especially fiscal equalization should come in parallel with fiscal decentralization. That's what we have discovered from those two presentations and two sessions. And the last discussant have had a very interesting proposal. Up until now, our fiscal decentralization was a kind of top-down way, but if it converted into bottom-up, and this should not be any more compulsory, but on a voluntary level, the local municipalities can decide if they want to have more revenues on their own needs. It was quite interesting to hear. And I would like to see if there's any question from the floor, 1 or 2, then we will take them. If not, let's directly move on to session 3 and 4. The topic of session 3 is fiscal decentralization and regional development in response to demographic change. And during the session, we've listened to Officer Byun Kyung-hwa concerning the response to population decrease, and also Senior Advisor Sverka have had a presentation on the regional development strategy in relation with the demographic change. So if you have any opinions on those topics, please address them. First of all, would like to ask President Kim Han-jung to make his own comments on regional policies in response to demographic change.
Good morning and good afternoon. I'm the president of Association of Metropolitan and Provincial Council Chairs, and I'm also chair of South Jeolla Provincial Council. The third session was on the fiscal decentralization and regional development in response to demographic change. So we focused on the population change. So I'm going to briefly talk about my opinions. The Korean market has neglected laborers and women, and we focused only on the economic growth. As a result, unstable residence and the gender inequality or income inequality are the social issues. And with the extremely low birth rate, all of these issues are even worsened. With the low growth and low birth rate and income polarization, I believe these issues will continue in Korea. So the speed of decreasing birth rate should be slowed down, and the state and the local government should make efforts to resolve issues in healthcare, gender, and also the issues of decreasing population. Also, the disposable income of citizens should be increased, and the government should implement policies to make livelihood more safer and secure. When it comes to safer living conditions, I believe we need to focus more on the balanced development of different regions. To this end, before developing new towns, I believe the underdeveloped region should be focused for its infrastructure, including transportation, etc., so that we can prevent outflow of population, and at the same time, they can have a balanced development. With the depopulation, we are witnessing a rapid aging population, and some depopulated areas should be integrated together, and the residents who are to be integrated should be migrated through more bold policies. All of the points that I've mentioned can be implemented at a local government level, and to that end, I believe there should be a sufficient fiscal decentralization and revamping of regulations. That was my point on session 3. For session 4, on post-COVID-19 consequences for intergovernmental coordination, I believe the important topics have already been covered, so I'm going to briefly tell you about my opinion. In Korea, the COVID-19 has led to rediscovery of country and the rediscovery of the importance of decentralization. With the COVID-19, the state revealed relevant information in a transparent manner and announced all the important information, and also established a system to provide the necessary materials, and it resulted in the national trust for the government about the quarantine efforts. The local government also established a drive-through screening station and life-friendly measures, including the relief subsidy. And this was combined with the local currency as well, which was a creative measure, and this was actually put into practice. So the local governments have become more important, unlike before. The problem is that to maintain these achievements, we have some physical issues, and how are we going to resolve this? If the state and the local governments cannot resolve the fiscal issue, the voluntary participation as of now by the citizens cannot be continued in the future. The central government and the local municipalities should be given a similar fiscal authorities. If not, the local governments will depend more on the central government, which will hinder creative and active response by the local government. Also, the support system should be established for citizens, and to that end, we need more fiscal and administrative authorities transferred to the local governments. So the state and local governments, civic society, and the market should be linked together through a strong response, and the supports are necessary. That's it for me. Thank you. So you even covered the discussion on session 4. Now we will invite Luis de Mello from OECD. And if you have any additional points on the discussion, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me back. Probably a word or two on session 3. It's really a very important topic, not only in Korea, but also in other countries around the world that are also facing the challenge of a very rapidly aging population. The case of Southern Europe is another case in point. Countries like Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece have some of the lowest rates of population change in the world nowadays. What is interesting that came up in the discussion, in my view, was the link that was made between urbanization, the effect that it tends to have on fertility. So typically as countries urbanize, rates of population growth come down, and the link between that and urban and regional development policies in general. Also how we can operate in this interface between regional development and fiscal decentralization. One of the key challenges that the population aging creates for different regions and cities in a country is that it's a very asymmetric shock. The concentration of older people tends to take place in parts of the country and not in others. Some more remote areas or urban areas tend to depopulate faster than others. And in those places that are losing population, one key challenge that they have to face is that the unit delivery costs tend to rise. It becomes more expensive to maintain the same level of services to the population and to face the changes that exist, with the population aging in the needs and preferences of the resident populations. It was also interesting that discussions in session 3 focused on some options available to governments, issues related to equalization. Should there be more equalization, basically to respond or to reflect this asymmetric shock in the costs of delivering services? So if one equalizes costs or capacities to deliver service around the world, the impact of demographics could be taken into account. The other one is intergovernmental cooperation, how to make sure that jurisdictions that are facing the same challenges can then exchange experience, identify good practices, and learn from each other in that area. A lot of scope for experimentation was also mentioned. So this element of innovation in the public sector, related to regional development and fiscal decentralization, is also very important to respond to the demographic challenges. And the fourth element that I think was very interesting that came out in the discussions was the role of digitalization. Can, to a certain extent, moving towards more digital ways of interacting with society, better equip governments to deal with the pressures related to population aging. So a fascinating topic, very relevant in different parts of the world, and a few ideas about options for tackling those challenges came up very strongly in the discussions. Thank you.
Let us now move on to session 4. Through the discussion and presentations of session 4, Professor Kwak Kyung-gun of Daejeon University have presented on best cases of K-quarantine and the empowerment of local governments in response to COVID-19. And also he has touched upon the need for robust governance strategy. Also, Director Lamia Kamachau of OECD has presented on the importance of intergovernmental cooperation post-COVID era for the resilient recovery. So on this, I would like to ask Director Kim Jong-un of OECD to comment.
The theme of session 4 was post-COVID-19 consequences for intergovernmental coordination. First presenter, Mr. Hyuk-keun Kwang's key message was the importance of so-called robust governance In the era of post-COVID-19, he listed 6 properties of robust governance, such as scalability, prototyping, modularization, bounded autonomy, bricolage, and strategic polyvalence and adaptive capacity. So this is a list of difficult words, but Mr. Kwak explains the meaning of each word using the case study of Korea's fight against COVID-19. For example, the rapid response of KCDC in early 2020, such as speedy approval of test kit and the adoption of drive-through testing demonstrates the importance of prototyping. So in conclusion, he emphasized the importance of the role of local government in the system of multi-level government as a key player of robust governance. The presentation of Ms. Lamia Kamil-Chao shows the regionally and nationally diverse impact of COVID-19. The response to the COVID-19 crisis is diverse as well. And she discussed a broad range of issues regarding the impact of COVID-19, such as health social impact, economic impact, and fiscal impact. Lamia's key message can be summarized as strong coordination between all actors in charge of the response at central and regional levels is the basis of an effective response, to which I agree 100%. I think the case of Korea in its response to COVID-19 has an important implication on the ideal role of local government and more broadly on intergovernmental fiscal relations. So if you look back, at the early stage of COVID-19, the central government of Korea adopted the now famous strategy of trace, test, and treat based on the scientific knowledge in the medical community and also in the Korea Center for Disease Control, now promoted to Korea Disease Control Agency. But then the time and personnel cost of testing became an important issue, a kind of bottleneck in the central government strategy of trace, test, and treat. Then an idea of drive-through testing was first developed by a hospital in Incheon City, and then it was immediately adopted by hospitals in Daegu City, where the cases of COVID-19 were exploding. So the lesson of this episode is the importance of laboratory federalism, or generally speaking, the importance of decentralized decision-making. However, let's not forget that this was all possible because of the scientific knowledge in the private sector and the medical community. So the role of governments shines when it strengthens the information exchange between people and government. What I'm trying to say is to re-emphasize the importance of collaboration and coordination between levels of government in enriching people's idea and the quality of life. In other words, what matters most in the structure of multi-level government, and certainly in response to COVID-19, is not the degree of centralization or decentralization, as Lamia strongly emphasized, but coordination and collaboration among levels of government. This sounds very natural, but in reality, the discussion on decentralization is often dominated by the objective of achieving a certain degree of decentralization than on how to strengthen the mechanism of coordination and the exchange of information between people and government. To my view, many presentations given yesterday and today confirmed that the importance of coordination and collaboration will increase rather than decrease in the era of post-COVID-19. Thank you.
For the administration, not just for the state, but the local governments, we had a direction based on an assumption that population is growing. So we focused on quantitative growth. So we also focused our investment in SOC, but as you may well know, this is not just a rural area issue. Even in large urban areas, depopulation has already begun. Then I believe because the administrative environment has changed, the administration system needs to be changed as well. Is the administrative demand decreasing because of the depopulation? I don't think so. We need more sophisticated and thorough administration. So the demand for administration is going to be higher, and there will be expected a blind spot of administration, and we need to prepare for this. There are many solutions, but one of the solutions could be untagged and online administration. This is not something we intended, but with the COVID-19, I believe that in the beginning it was a bit weird, but many things have become now so familiar. Even the online conference, this was maybe common for large-scale international conference, but even in domestic conferences and meetings, now it has become such a routine to have an online conference. I believe it has given us a valuable opportunity in this regard. In line with the administrative demand for the future, we need to consider whether we can discover any other areas for more innovation. One of the solutions is to do with the fostering of a local community. The demand for administration varies depending on the characteristics of residents, and there's limitation for administrative agency to fulfill all of the demands. But if we focus on the local community, we can provide more tailored administration. So the government should come up with more support or measures to foster small-scale local communities. As we overcome the COVID-19, we have witnessed ourselves the power of a small local community, such as the elderly care services or child care services. There will be exponential growth in demand in these sectors. I believe the local communities can provide important solutions, and it will be less of a burden and more effective. So the facilitation of a local community and the government support for fostering of these local communities, all of these should be strengthened. So the municipality revision is related to these points. Thank you. So he emphasized the importance of local community. Do you have any extra comment as well, Mayor Ha?
Going through COVID-19 these days, we have been through many difficulties, and we are now, and we have been paying the cost for that. And one of the important values that we discovered is that of local community. And citizens and our people have naturally discovered and recognized the importance of the value of community. And the response of Korea, well, actually, there are criticisms on the response of Korea in terms of cost and economic value for money. But regarding the value of community, as we have all recognized it unanimously, I think this already tells what was important to us. So, assuming that this kind of situation can happen again, for us to become a sustainable society, we are supposed to form a community-based society and region, and we as municipalities have to be more active and proactive. That's what I've discovered as insight. And as one of the municipalities, we will put more efforts to explore a lot more government sector programs. But it's not easy for us to be leading all policy measures. And we have our inherent limitations of being an official of the government. So in terms of skills and approach methodologies, we might have our limitations, and that's why the importance of governance matters a lot more than ever. So if we could share our common vision in partnership with private sector, and within that strengthened framework, if we could achieve cooperative policies, that value will be able to be realized. Many have been touched upon throughout 2 days, but what's most important to us is to start from the smallest community, a small village, so that we can empower them to lead the way of life for the future for all. Thank you. Well, Professor Kwak Hyun-gun has just emphasized the robust governance, and Mayor Ho had repeated and reiterated that importance again, regardless of emergencies or crises that might be exposed in the future. So I think we have now come to on the same page in that sense. Well, other than those topics that we touched upon during the past 2 days, if you have any more questions and comments on other subjects, please address them. But if not, I would like to wrap up our discussions for 2 days. Thank you very much, Chair Kim Jong-hoon of OECD Network and other relevant members from OECD, and Deputy Minister Lee Jae-kwan of Ministry of Interior and Safety, and Ho Tae-jung, Mayor of Daejeon City, and President Kim Han-jung, and President of the National Association of Mayors and Governors. During the past 2 days, we have had many discussions and presentations on fiscal decentralization autonomy for an inclusive nation. And through this conference, I hope that we can contribute to the creation and to the preparation for the new future centered on regions and municipalities in exploring new policy directions aligned with the OECD member countries. And I hope we could continue our exchange and cooperation between two institutions of OECD and PCAD. And I hope that we could meet in person next year.
Thank you very much to all and all persons concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The Chairman Kim Soon-eun of PCAD was a moderator, and we had 5 additional discussants. So the discussant can now move back to your seats. Now we are closing the conference. All the sessions of the PCAD OECD International Conference has been concluded. We could not invite all the participants here at the venue, but we are joined by many experts online, and we had some really constructive discussion. Thank you, all participants who joined us online. Under the theme of inclusiveness and decentralization, we had a 2-day conference. Decentralization and fiscal decentralization were the major topics, and we had some practical discussion to develop into an inclusive autonomous country. I believe this conference would be a great contributor. We would like to ask for your continuous interest, and the next event we'd like to see each and every one of you at the event venue for more active discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you viewers for joining us for today. Thank you very much.